The Destruction of a Nigger Mentality by C.C. Blackman. And we're going to continue on several different aspects of the whole thing that's going on between the black community, what I'm said, and you know, how we are perpetuating and destroying our own selves. So we're going to turn it over to the author.
Yeah, so as we were talking about in the previous episode, I think that it's very important that we pay attention to what's going on in the family life and the shifting values from keeping the family together to this new value of, this individualism. You know, it's all about my individual progress, and we're not necessarily concerned about the values that really allowed us to survive as a people. It's very important that we look at the role of the black father in the family, and we reestablish in our minds that we need our fathers present in home, functioning as protectors of black women and children, not just from violent aggression, but also psychologically, you know, to supervise some of this music. Because, you know, let's face it, a woman can't be the breadwoman, the winner, the disciplinarian, all those other things. It takes a team effort. It takes that, you know, she can't do all of those things. You can't be sweet with the kid 1 minute and then sour. It doesn't work. You have to have those roles divided oftentimes between both parents. But, you know, another thing that, you know, I was talking to a friend of mine about your book, the book Without a Name, and I was so impressed with the level of honesty that poured forth out of your book. And I was saying to somebody that, you know, this sister has got something here, because she is able to articulate her life experience in such a natural and honest way, you know, which is one of the big things that I think is an obstacle for our people. We have a real problem with honesty. Yes. And we have a real problem with accepting education from each other. And part of that is because, you know, honesty a lot of times has been associated so much with a sense of shame, you know. Right. Let's take, for example, if you look at the English language, we refer to a child without a father as a bastard, which is ridiculous because the child had no preparation or planning in his parenting. You have two people who may, for whatever reason, have been irresponsible or did not want to make a commitment to each other, and so the child gets labeled from birth as a bastard. That's just like original sin. These concepts, you know, are crippling. You know what I mean? So all this time, this child is filled with shame because of a circumstance he had no control over. It's like being born into poverty. You were born into poverty. The great experience, or the great, I guess, understanding should be, I'm thrilled to be alive. My life is filled with opportunity. Anything can happen. But instead, you're saddled with all this shame and guilt because somebody told you that you are worthless because you don't have a certain material status or you can't buy certain things. It's a shame when I talk to the little kids, man. I mean, at the ages of 4 and 5, start playing the dozens. You know, your mother eats welfare cheese and your sneakers are cheap. And this kind of talk creates such a material ethic in our children before they can even start school. Right. They go to school and the school system is an abysmal failure. Not necessarily because you don't have people in the school system concerned about education, and it's not necessarily because all of the education is flawed, just most of it. The problem is, I think that we do not really fundamentally understand what was taught to us by John Henry Clark, who said so eloquently that we do not understand the true purpose of education. And everywhere I go, and anytime I have an opportunity to address our people in particular, I always like to talk about the true purpose of education. And John Henry Clark explained in one of his books that in one of his lectures, that the true purpose of education is to teach the student to be a handler of power. Teach the student to be a handler of power in the sense that, you know, you are being prepared to run the society and to have power. Of course, you should have integrity and all of the other things. But the thing about it is that he goes on to say that the power structure or the school system as it exists cannot afford to teach black people how to manage power because they are in a struggle to maintain a dominant position. So what happens with our kids is when they enter the school system, and we have to remember that things like social studies and history are very critical. The dominant culture writes the history. And so by the time our kids go to school and they listen to, you know, the founding fathers, white people discovered everything, did everything worth remembering in history, these kids start to say, how is it that black people get power? Particularly our black boys. They say to themselves, how do I get power? Man, in first grade, they're playing the dozens. How am I going to get some power? So the black kid starts to drift and look out the window, and he realizes that it's the guy selling the drugs who appears to have power as a black man. When he hears about architects, lawyers, and doctors, and developers, and business people, he's not generally listening to stories about black men. He's listening to the tales of white men. So as far as he's concerned, he cannot relate to that paradigm or that example, and as a result of that, he starts to look for how black men get power, which more often than not is in something that is corrupt. Okay, and that was all by design. So I think that it's very important that we start to look at education as something that has to function in a dual way. It has to take place in the school system, but it must most importantly take place at home. We must tell our children the terrible history of our oppression in this country, and we have to tell our children that there are schemes and designs designed to keep them psychologically, economically, mentally enslaved. And so they have to have principles and ideas that teach them how to manage their resources, their money, so that they're not driving you crazy, telling you that they got to keep up with pop culture and keep up with the latest bling bling in an effort to have some self-esteem. Right. They would be able to grow up and understand that if they got food on the table and they got loving parents that care about them, that are teaching them their history and are cultivating them to do great things and putting self-esteem into them, that's the most important function. And so I think that that is a very, very, very critical thing. Another thing that we have to do is we have to realize that when you are waging war, you know, I want to talk about religion for a minute. You know, I have nothing against religion. Now, I've read your book, and your views on religion are very much in accord with mine. The fact of the matter is, there's all kinds of paths, or religious paths to God. That's fine, but you ain't doing nothing until you really get into some spirituality.
Thank you.
I always tell people that religion is the bridge to spirituality, and unfortunately most of us get stuck on the bridge, arguing the different brand names of religion instead of understanding that the goal is to get to some righteousness and to some connectedness with your concept of the divine, and to let that manifest in your behavior. This is very, very important. But also, when you look at our struggle as a people, I think it's important to remember that we are attempting to address our situation with a religious effort.
Yes.
Which makes no sense.
Right.
Because in any black community, you have almost a church on every corner, storefront preachers everywhere, you got a mosque, a synagogue. I can go to any street in the black community, I can get you a Buddhist, a Muslim, a Hare Krishna, a Wicca, a devil worshiper, I can get you all of that. We are into every kind of religion possible, and unfortunately, there is no religious solution to us. There are two complexes that were very important that the slave master gave the slave. One complex was that you are dirty, filthy, unworthy, and undeserving, and you're being punished for something that you have done. The second complex was that you are not right with God. You are not right with God, and there's something wrong with you. Your situation of enslavement is a curse on you. And so for centuries, we have been looking under our armpits, wondering about what's wrong with us, why God won't bless us, and all these other things, you know, and the preachers really know how to pimp off of this. You know, I always tell people they call the preacher the pastor, you know, and you are supposed to be the flock or the sheep feeding off the pastor, but it's actually the opposite. The pastor's feeding off of you. I mean, you think about Jesus Christ and you think about the founder of Christianity. He said that it's more difficult for a rich man to get through, you know, to heaven than a camel through the eye of a needle. So why is this such an emphasis on materialism by these churches? I mean, it would be one thing if they were really dealing with unwed mothers and really building institutions and places for our children. And some of them do some good things, but the overwhelming majority exists to essentially pimp off the people. Yeah. And you know, what I say is that, you know, we have to be responsible personally for our own spiritual development. We can't rely on these preachers to fill us with fear, fill us with self-doubt, fill us with a sense of you know, I'm not good enough, you know, and then this whole idea of you owe God some money and you got to give God X amount of your salary is ridiculous. My mother was fond of saying, and my mother was a very, very spiritual person, and she had her particular religious beliefs, but she used to always tell me that my father in heaven is a millionaire. God has planets of gold. He has planets of platinum. He does not need my miserable few dollars, you know what I mean, in order for him to keep up his campaign. The whole world is the place of worship for God. So we shouldn't just expend, you know, years ago preachers weren't like this. The preacher had a job and he gave his religious message as a free service to the community. It wasn't that, you know, his job was, you know, taking the community and having them support his lavish lifestyle, you know, with their, you know, a lot of them have substandard jobs and are struggling, but they, you know, the most important and the most heartfelt need in a human being is to have that connection to the divine. You want to know that you're right with God. That's something that's intrinsic and very, very important to Africans.